Hello and welcome to the besea.cc podcast called No Time for Silence. As we've been saying, the besea.cc stands for the British East and Southeast Asian Christian Collective. And we're a grassroots movement that really seeks to serve and represent East and Southeast Asian Christian communities and churches. And I'm your host, Wayne Fung. And we've been doing this under this banner of BC.cc, a pilot group to help people grow, a growth group to help people grow, to support their healing and encourage leadership and reflection to empower people in what they might be doing in their own community as Asian Christians. I really firmly believe that in this society, as we tackle all kinds of issues as Christians, we really need to start with ourselves, because in this society there's so much dysfunction and reactivity to issues, and we can be easily been triggered and thrown in the deep end, and we were not careful, we might not be responding well. So the first place to start is really ourselves and allow God to reform and transform us. And this podcast is all about not keeping silent and allowing those who are in our growth group to have a space to provide their insights and let people know what we've been learning in their own journey. I'm so grateful that today on this episode we have Esther joining us, and she's a Canadian-born Chinese living in the UK. So Esther, why don't you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Wayne, and really glad to be here today. I'm actually going to make a correction. I was not born in Canada. I was actually born in Hong Kong, but migrated to Canada when I was 6, and I grew up there, went to a Chinese ethnic church, and then moved to the States for a bit of my university studies before coming over here to the UK.
Wow, of course, I know all that detail. I made that error on purpose to create something as a hook to get you to speak more. Wow, so that's your heritage. So can you tell us a bit about what is your experience as an East Asian Christian then?
That's a really, really big question, Wayne, that you started
Mm,
with. Um, where to begin? I would say probably with my particular experience within a Chinese ethnic church in Vancouver. Um, I think that has been really formative in terms of how I've experienced my faith in a Chinese sort of ethnic context. Obviously, in a Chinese ethnic church, a lot of, I feel, the cultural aspects of the Chinese community sometimes did bleed into how sort of faith is expressed. And particularly growing up in that particular community, I felt that as a young girl, I always wanted to please, my parents, my aunties and uncles in the church. And for me at that time, I would say that I was not a Christian because I did a lot of the church activities, whether that is Sunday school, whether that is, the Sunday services, the Awana clubs. We had Awana back then. It was the Bible memorization sort of clubs that we had in North America primarily. I did it just to please, people around me, right? It wasn't necessarily doing it for my own sort of, out of my own sort of faith, it wasn't out of my belief. It was more to say, look, I'm going to put on this particular sort of facade or a front, you know, to ensure that the family sort of honor or name is maintained. And
wow.
so that was kind of, yeah, that was kind of what I grew up in. And it wasn't only until I went off to, during a gap year between my undergrad and my postgrad, where I really found God, or God found me.
Mm. So it's really fascinating that you're talking about that internal kind of drive that
Mm.
you felt that you had to kind of honor your family, to do what you think you need to do. Were you aware of that when you were doing it, or now on reflection, you're more aware of it?
Yeah, I think, growing up in that community, it was just a done thing. Maybe I wasn't so aware of it at the time because, all my peers, everyone, and I think the sort of positive reinforcement that you had as a kid, right? Whether or not it was kind of like your aunties and uncles say, oh, so and so's kid did so great on this exam, or, oh, wow, they did so great on that piano sort of like, performance and what have you. You kind of internalize all of that and you sort of start building your sort of value system, right? Based on that sort of like feedback from your parents, from your aunties and uncles, which, now that I'm a Christian, I know that, there was too much emphasis, right? On that sort of academic achievement, on the sort of like, personal achievements, that sort of reliance on the self, which is basically an antithesis to what the gospel is about, right? The gospel is to admit that you cannot, do this on your own. You cannot just, strive, for these sort of like worldly endorsements and achievements to get your fulfillment and joy in life. That was what sort of hit me. During that sort of gap year, it was just so empty, raking up all these sort of like, achievements. And yet at the same time, I was not satisfied. I didn't have that sort of sense of joy in my life.
But in an interesting way, were your family happy with your achievement?
Of course, I think any sort of, Chinese parents who's had a kid who, went off and did a lot of, on paper, right? Wonderful sort of CV, the sort of academic institutions I went to, it was what gave them a sense of pride, right? It wasn't necessarily, my kid is, faithfully following the Lord. Obviously, they cared about my sort of spirituality too, but it was never overtly sort of expressed to me. I don't recall a time when my parents actually said, what, I'm really proud of the fact that, you are, following the Lord, that you are really sort of committed to your faith. And I think maybe this is where, again, the Chinese sort of culture bleeds into their understanding of faith, right? Just as long as, on the surface, I am doing the right things, it must mean that my sort of, spiritual health was okay. It was very much that sort of, upon reflection, it's very much like the Pharisees, just putting on that sort of show to sort of just say like, you're doing all the right things, you're saying all the right things, but deep down, did I actually have that heart transformation? At that time, no, absolutely not, right? I was doing it for the wrong motives.
Wow, the drive to have achievement, to have performance, to conform, to meet expectation, not merely for yourself, for your own self, kind of like personal growth, yeah, but it's really also for other people and family and honor. But also the flip side is often that achievement might not be reflected by a sense of celebration of what you're really good at. Yeah, so it's always a sense that, oh, not good enough, not good enough. And I think talking to other non-Asian folks, I think sometimes they're not aware of this side of our Asian culture, of the power of honor and shame, and how it drives our decisions. But I want to ask you, what do you think is good and is worth celebrating about our Asian heritage as Christians?
Yeah, it might have seemed that, off the bat that I'm just slagging off, my sort of Asian heritage. But I think there are a lot of things that, in upon reflection, as a more mature Christian now, there are a lot of great things, right, that I grew up with that I would absolutely want to keep. And I would probably sort of pass on to my kids if I were to have kids in the future. The things such as like, having that sense of perseverance, that sense of drive. And I think that bleeds into the sort of, that immigrant sort of mentality that you have, right? You have to absolutely sort of just like work hard. That sort of sense of work ethic is quite strong. That is something that, like Paul running that sort of race, it's a marathon and it's not going to be sort of like a quick win. You're in it for the long haul. And so I think, and that going on to that sort of long haul aspect, right? I think that also goes into the sort of relationships, right? I think relationships are very important too. in that sort of like Asian context, especially the sense of community, right? You
Mm.
do not want to burn bridges with anyone. And even if you have to sort of just like, put on a face to sort of like, meet particular individuals that you should not like, I'm not saying that you should not have authentic and genuine relationships. There's, whole heaps of like, problematic areas in terms of how relationships are built, particularly in the Chinese community. But, that sense of, let's just be a community. Let's sort of like, have meals. Let's really make that sort of effort to, really just even sharing dim sum, like after church. That sense of community, I really do appreciate. And I think that's where, in a less sort of communal or, community oriented sort of like collectivist sort of like culture, right? In the
Mm.
West, it's very individualistic, but I think that, in the Chinese culture, what I learned was the value of, caring for your community, right? Caring for your family, not just like your nuclear family, but, your extended family too. I think that's really important.
Yeah, you're right. Yes, the sense of connection with other people, that you as a human being, especially as a Christian, a redeemed person, you're more than just yourself. Your relationship with God, like a one-way thing, and it's about
Yeah.
me, and it's defined not by just yourself, but it's in relation to other people. And I think at our Asian heritage, the connectivity, collectivist kind of mentality, really connect well with that. Easier to understand. We lean more towards that, and when we read the Bible, we see a lot more about the unity, the connection, the family, all like harmony, all the kind of things, isn't it? And obviously, the danger sometimes is are we rewrapping um, uh, our culture just with the gospel message around it to make it kind of like sound gospel, but
Mm.
then it's actually just our own culture? Or how do we transform our culture by the gospel, but still have a distinctive, but then not allowing the distinctive kind of to affect the gospel? Um,
Yeah.
I was talking to a friend this week and about racism, and he's an African person, black person, and obviously their perspective is it's unique, their own history of dealing with racism,
Mm.
and he was talking about, oh, you know what, in James, book of James, the had a habit of calling out injustices in the community. Yeah, addressing
Mm.
oppression and inequalities to people, and quite direct. We'll read James chapter 2. It talks about how James was pinpointing how the rich were oppressing some of the weak and saying it's not right, calling out. And I was saying, well, you know what? It's really interesting you say that. And maybe you can say that in your community. But I thought, how's it going to work out in an Asian community or towards Asian who, so
Mm.
telling them to calling out that somebody's wrong and unjust? I thought this doesn't normally happen. What are your thoughts on this in terms of, in an Asian perspective, calling out injustices so in a direct way? How do you think would be perceived?
I could really only, I think, imagine, say, for instance, the aunties and uncles or like my parents, how they would deal with a particular sort of, racist incident, right? Um, well, actually, I have a very personal one that comes to mind. So, say, for instance, there was there was a time when I was still quite young. I think I was around 6 or 7. We had just moved to Canada, and my parents just bought a house in a new neighborhood. Now, we were the only sort of Chinese on the block. And I remember, my parents, we were driving back home, up our driveway, and then suddenly I saw like, a whole load of graffiti, right, on our garage door. And at the time, I didn't know better, right? I was, really young, and I was like, oh, why is there so much graffiti on our garage door? I said something wasn't right. But I remember my dad, he basically said, oh, it's nothing, like, it's all right, there's nothing to. So, and I remember, asking, I was like, I recall there was like a word like China in there somewhere. I could read, right? But I didn't understand, like, my English was still very, very sort of like, preliminary, basic. I just came from, Hong Kong. And reflecting back on that particular incident, I'm sure the people who wrote that particular sort of like, it was probably a, racial slur or like some sort of racist sort of comment, that because why would you just sort of like graffiti someone's garage, right? um And yeah, my dad's response was essentially to sort of just like, okay, let's just like brush it under the carpet. Let's not talk about it. It's, maybe shameful, etc. I remember like, the graffiti was basically like erased, by my dad. Like the next year, he just painted all over it, very quickly and stuff. So I think there's maybe, in that sense, again, going back to that sort of immigrant mentality, right? You don't want to rock the boat. Maybe I'm psychoanalyzing my dad's reaction here, but maybe he doesn't want to sort of like rock the boat, right? He's new to the sort of community. Doesn't want to kick up a fuss, right? And I think that is also translated to, how he, in my parents' generation, right? How they would address anything that is, considered conflictual, or anything that is, might cause a sort of disturbance or some sort of, like, well, basically they don't want to address anything that might cause a rift in the community. Yeah. And that has bled into everything, within the church, whether it's, say, for instance, a sort of conflict between the English congregation and like Chinese congregation. No one wants to talk about it, even though it is literally the sort of elephant in the room, right?
Wow.
And so I think it's definitely one of the unhealthier aspects, right? Where there's that sense of avoidance, of conflict, and sort of just like papering, right? Putting band-aids over things instead of actually addressing sort of like the root causes, right? Of the sort of behaviors that you see, or root causes of a lot of the sort of conflicts within the community.
Wow. I'm so sorry for your experience. I'm sure it's left an impression on you. And your analogy, your that picture of, say, your dad painted over it. It wasn't just literal. It was figuratively. Is like, this is how we deal with things.
Absolutely.
We paint over it, but painting over it cannot resolve it because it's still underneath it. Yeah,
Absolutely.
and you today are still talking about it.
Yes,
Yeah.
it has left an impression, right? Because you see those patterns of behavior. And in some ways, growing up in that community, you learn that, right? And that's why, growing up, I just never had that sort of, I guess, like vocabulary, or even the sort of, I guess, like, process that was modeled by the elders, right? In terms of how do you actually, right, address conflict, address sort of difficult issues in a healthy sort of Christian way. And I'm still learning, right?
Hmm.
There's so much unlearning that I have to do, and so also relearning that I have to do in this space.
That is a great kind of segue to my next question. Really, my question really is, what more can, say, with Chinese, what more can Chinese or ethnic churches, or even as an Asian in a non-Asian church, yeah, what can we do to help uh, Asian Christians to figure out these issues about injustices, mental health stigma, and all kinds of issues that are really uncomfortable, and but that it's been plaguing our community? What more can we do to help as Christians with these issues, really?
Again, that's $1 million question, right, Wayne? How can we actually sort of, unpick, right, the sort of generations of trauma and the sort of issues that have pervaded the community? It's not going to be solved overnight, but I think there are some, if we could get, say, for instance, even the leadership of the churches, right, to talk about these things. These are obviously uncomfortable topics, but where I have seen them addressed is when the leadership actually, takes the sort of like bold step forward and say, look, I am going to role model, I'm going to, say, give space, right, and license for the church community to start talking about this. Because without that sort of like leadership sort of position, that posture, right,
Hmm.
then your congregation is not going to have that sense of, trust and comfort in saying that it is actually okay, to talk about difficult sort of issues, right, in the open and resolve it. When your leadership also, starts talking about these things, it also signals that it is important, right? It is an important part of faith. And we cannot, as a community, just, you know, talk about the nice things only, right? And disregard particularly sort of troubled history or, taboo sort of subjects just because it might not be comfortable for some certain members of the community. If we're really trying to model Jesus's love, right? Jesus didn't shy away, right, from addressing the difficult sort of issues of his day. And
Mm.
he also went to where the so-called sort of what Pharisees would deem the sort of nasty bits, right? The sinful bits of society. You know, he didn't shy away from getting his hands dirty, right? He was really sort of like just mucking in and trying to, untangle, the sort of, sinful nature that is within all of us. And so I think in order to really live out our faith authentically, right, we need to have those spaces. We need to have the
Yeah.
leadership to be bold enough to say, like, look, we're none of us are perfect, and we need to be vulnerable with each other, confess our sins with each other, and so that we could just spur each other on in our walk, right, with the
Yeah,
Lord.
absolutely spot on. And I know that you're very insightful, outspoken person. I've seen you wear a T-shirt that says "Racism is evil." Yeah,
To a church event, yeah, exactly.
to a church event about, I think, hospitality and really addressing these issues. And he's like, "Oh, racism is evil." Yeah, outspoken. But I want to ask you a question. This is the actual really at the heart of it as we think about this stuff. How do you feel if you have to say all these things in a Asian context community to people who are a different generation or don't agree with you, and knowing that all that kind of conflict and difficulty might get rocked up because people don't want to talk about it. People want to paint it over, but you and I, and maybe other people, want to talk about it. How do you actually, you feel if you have to do that?
And that is tough, right? Because, as someone who's grown up in that particular community, I do find myself reverting back to my sort of position in the sort of hierarchy, so to speak, whenever I'm in that particular space. You
Hmm.
know, it's just something that is, I think, learned, right? It's a learned behavior. And I have yet to sort of find that sort of like way, to actually speak up in a constructive sort of manner in those particular spaces because it hasn't been modeled to me before. I basically have to sort of like, through trial and error, thinking, okay, do you know what? One day I'm going to be super direct and I'm just going to like, say it. Nope, that did not work at all. It absolutely backfired on me. Right. So it's one of those things where you're straddling essentially two sorts of like cultures. And I feel like I definitely do sort of like code switch, right? Dependence on the sort of, context that I'm in. And in that sort of like Chinese context, in that sort of like with all the intergenerational sort of dynamics with it, I definitely am still very sort of, I would say, like deferential. If I were to meet, say, for instance, like, an elder or like a pastor, within the Chinese sort of community, it's like, oh, uncle, how are you? And stuff like that, right? It wouldn't, because I know that I am still being perceived not as a peer, even though I'm like in my 30s, but as a child, effectively, right? There's that whole sort of hierarchy that I
Hmm.
have to just break down, and I don't know how to break that down. And
Hmm.
I don't blame my sort of parents' generation because that is literally what they've grown up with. Like, say, for instance, my grandma, she'll still tell off. All my aunties and uncles, and she's like, 90 or so, and she's very much the matriarch. So
Yeah. Yeah. I think we need to have self-compassion. Yeah, because obviously, as you have mentioned, you attempted to speak and do certain things that countercultural in those spaces, and it didn't work out too well, and you might feel a bit rough. But I think having self-compassion, but then you also have awareness. I think that's important. So awareness is the beginning of many things, many good things of transformation. Yeah, and I think you really highlighted one point about, I think, about yourself, ourselves, and also other people, like you mentioned, in the community who are acting certain ways, and those what we call autopilot. Yeah, that we're
mm,
acting in automatic, unthinking, unconscious way of how we've been formed, and people say that if autopilot is that car that takes you to where you don't want to go, anxiety is that fuel that makes that journey possible. So when we are in
mm,
those spaces, whether for yourself that you conform, or those who are older than you, who might just have the hierarchical kind of authority over people, they are reacting out of autopilot, and this anxiety get
absolutely.
triggered and they just do it. Yeah, they've been trained to do it, and it's like, oh, anxiety, clamp down, or anxiety, okay, shut up. Yeah, and those spaces, like, how do we step back and be aware and think, how do I then be myself but still connected with you, but I'm not
Mhm.
trying to damage relationship, but I can be myself. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe it's also around empathy and also just learning how to talk about emotions, because I feel that there's definitely that sort of intergenerational divide when it comes to willingness to really sort of be vulnerable and talk about, the things where, well, the things of the heart, really, right? The
Mm.
first time I remember really understanding the value of small group and Bible studies was actually here in the UK.
Wow.
Before in my sort of, Chinese church experience, all the sort of Bible studies was just all head knowledge. There was never any sort of application, okay, of the actual passage to your life. No one ever shared, right? In terms of, what, this particular passage is hitting me hard today because, for XYZ sort of reasons, I'm having a rough day at work, or, I'm having like a really bad conflict or fight with so and so and whatnot. That would never be shared, really. And I've never seen that, really modeled, right, by the sort of elders, okay, at the church. And so, yeah, it was only when I came here, I was like, wow, people are really sort of like genuine, and they really sort of speak about, the issues that are troubling them. And they're really reflecting on how the passage has spoke to them, right? Like, I never got that. It was all just about sort of just
Mm.
like, if you know the sort of key facts about like Israel sort of like, history, and if you know the dates for when the exile happened, or who the sort of key biblical characters are, then you're all set.
But the thing is, aren't they just digging deep into God's word and talking about our feelings are just being too humanistic?
I see what you're doing. Yeah, you're trying to be like, the sort of like, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not saying that we shouldn't learn that sort of like, the sort of facts of the Bible, right? But there's also something, you know, the Bible changes lives, right? And through our sort of witnessing of, our lives, right? If we don't actually sort of share how the Bible has impacted on us and how our lives have been transformed, the issues of the heart, right? Again, going back to that sort of like comment around, the performative sort of nature of faith, in the sort of like Chinese context, right? Without actually sort of saying, stripping away all those sort of like, clothes and layers, right? So to speak. And saying, look, actually, my heart is so far away from God, for these particular reasons. These are the areas where I'm struggling, in terms of sin, in terms of my relationships, etc. Then how would you, if you're growing up in that culture, how would you actually know that the faith is actually genuine? And how would you know that, the Bible actually impacts on people's, lives, right? And
Mm.
so that's where I find, not to say that we shouldn't learn about the sort of history of Israel, but it needs to also be, like Paul's letters, right, to the all the different churches. He was always, saying, you guys, I'm praying for you. I know that these areas have been struggles, but he also rebukes the sort of churches because he knows, right, like their behaviors and the sort of like issues that they're dealing with, and he doesn't shy away from those things. But I
Sure.
feel like I could never imagine, right? Yeah, I've never heard in my sort of, 18 years of going to like a Chinese church, right, where a fellow sort of believer would actually sort of say, look, I know so much about your personal life that I also have built up that trust with you to rebuke you for particular sort of areas in your life, and also to encourage you, right, for the areas that you are
Mm.
walking in the Lord with.
Right.
And so that's where, you know to have that particular sort of like, you see that in the Bible, that's how, Christians back in the day lived, then why not, is it not lived out in the same way, right, in the sort of
Yeah.
current context?
It's very true. And I wonder all the time whether Jesus or Paul and anyone else in the Bible, if they were here today, how much would they really be welcomed into the churches today? I don't think they'll survive.
Mm.
Yeah, because they're too authentic and too edgy. Now, you talked a bit about vulnerability and authenticity, and one of the work that we have in our growth group is to draw out our own, what we call a genogram. So it's more than a family tree, it's painting a good narrative, a story of how a family is, the function and dynamic within our family. Tell us what that was like for you, kind of reflecting and drawing out and thinking about your own genogram.
Man, it was tough. I mean, it's a lot of the things that's been buried, for years, right? And to have that space where I'm not the only person, right, going through that sort of, you know, going through our family history, the sort of shared issues, right, that we all have when it comes to, say, for instance, shame, guilt, right? The whole sort of, a lot of abuse that's happened, right? That doesn't, get talked about. It's, it was cathartic, but at the same time, it it made me realize, wow, I have so many difficult conversations um, that I need to have with my own family, right? It's because it's just been buried, right? So deep, it's just been papered over, right? And it's never been, openly discussed.
Hmm.
And so there will never be a good time for it, because it'll definitely be a difficult conversation. I don't know how my family will react to those conversations either, because, this, it's not something that they've practiced, for one, right? And I wouldn't assume that they would be, particularly enthusiastic about, talking about these issues that have been buried very deeply, right? In their
Hmm.
own psyche too. So we probably need a therapist.
You probably do.
Yeah, to go through it. Yeah, absolutely. And so it's learning how, that whole intergenerational dynamic.
Hmm.
Would my parents sort of treat me as a peer when I have those conversations, right? That's always at the back of my mind. How can I have that sort of voice in that setting where they will actually take me seriously and not actually just rush me aside and say, oh, you know what, that is actually something that only the older generation should talk about. That is not within your particular sort of purview. It's really sort of saying, look, can we create that sort of space, right? Create that sort of opening to even have that conversation, right? And that's
Yeah.
the difficult part. And I think that kind of transcends also into the sort of church space too, right?
I think so. The powerful thing is as we reflect on society, it reflects our communities, it reflects our family. So the nuclear family, the family origin, is how a lot of time we get formed, and how we get our ideas, how to relate with one another, and how we react when certain things come up, and we will replay those things in all kinds of spaces. And the real work to be done is really in our own family like this. And
Yeah.
the key thing here, and as I hear listen to you, is I really hear a desire to think, oh, really hope that I hope they will treat you like a peer, treat you like an adult, isn't it? Whether it's in a family or society. But the truth is, and the challenging thing is, we can't change other people. We can't
No.
make them treat us differently. All we can do really is we have to be ourselves and be what people call regulated and self-differentiated. If I want you to treat me how I want you to treat me, I need to be that kind of person. So I'm going to learn to be that peer, that adult to speak to you. Now, you might not get that back when you speak to them. Yeah. But you can hold on to that anxious part, not get triggered as they react into their normal way or pattern, isn't it? People would still think that you're a child and would speak to you in that way. But if you keep being yourself in that kind of new mode, eventually the other will have to completely sabotage you, or they will have to change because you are changing the system by being yourself. Yeah, and that is a real work to do, is how do I be myself in the family, in the system. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So plenty of more things to learn.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah. I mean, if you're able to, is there anything you can share about your experience in the family that you might want to kind of like express and talk about that really stood out for you?
Oh, where to begin? I have a really big family, first off. And I think, growing up, I my family, our extended family, it's quite massive, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to go back to Hong Kong for, the duration of my sort of childhood. And so I've always felt close, quite close to my aunties and uncles and, my cousins there and my grandparents. But I guess it just makes me quite sad when I look at my genogram, because I know that, you know, we're now sort of, I'm obviously here in the UK, they're in Hong Kong, my parents are in, Canada. And how do we actually, right, have those conversations that require months of work, right, across the geographic sort of like divides and the time zones, right? This isn't something that I can do, over a Zoom call. Let's face it, it's not going to be like, everyone down into Zoom and now we're going to have like a family meeting about, the sort of like abuses that have happened in the family, the sort of like, the sort of like betrayals, the sort of like backstabbings, all this sort of stuff, right? Like we can't have those conversations, on Zoom. And that just makes me sad, right? Because I want a resolution, right, to this. And I don't think that I will ever get that resolution, in my lifetime. Maybe miraculously, all my family moves to the UK. Who knows, right? But
Yeah.
I don't see that as a very real sort of like, possibility. And so there will be some things that just will not be resolved, right? And I will just have to essentially, maybe, I don't know, I don't want it to eat away, at my sort of like core, right? And I'm someone who, when I find a problem, I absolutely just want to solve it. But I know that this is something that I just have to give over to the Lord, and maybe this is something that I just have to, make peace with the Lord about, right? And say, you know what, Lord, thankfully, majority of my family are believers. And I'm able to sort of say, look, God, you can do a miracle here. If we are one of the same spirit, you will be able to heal the sort of divides within the family. You will be able to, heal over the sort of like, hurts that we have, experienced by, our family members. And I have also hurt, right? Others in my family too, with my words and actions. And so that's the sort of hope that I have, in spite of the sort of current situation, of the sort of geographic divides that I have to grapple with.
Wow, Esther, I'm so grateful for your authenticity and your vulnerability. I think God hears your pain and your desire for that kind of reconciliation and closure. He hears your dream of having those conversation. And I think, like you said, you almost feel like it might not happen because all the things are against you, isn't it? Yeah, all the obstacles for that to happen. But that picture, that day hasn't come yet. Yeah.
Yeah, amen. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's that sort of like, that's what keeps me going, it's like, these conversations are obviously very emotional, right? When you think about everything that has happened, over the sort of like decades, and even just thinking about like the pain that, my grandparents, experience, that's just not talked about, that hurts. But I know that, God is going to, wipe away every tear that's been shed, right? There will be no more tears, in
Mm,
heaven, that there will be perfect sort of reconciliation, not only vertically, right? Not vertically, horizontally and vertically, right? With our peers and also with God. And so that's what gives me hope. That is what sort
yeah.
of like, keeps me going and not sort of spiral into a sort of, despair.
Mm. No one knows how many people in your family you're able to speak to and reconcile and have that peace and harmony again, isn't it? But I think it's what first step you can make. Who is the first person that you can start talking to and begin that
Mm.
kind of work and dialogue? I think that will be one of the key things for you, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Maybe get my mom to come over when I have my first kid, because she's always been clamoring for a kid. And so I'm just like, okay, mom, come on over, even though I know that it's going to be a very explosive few months.
Yeah. May not need to wait that long until you have a kid to have a conversation. Maybe a bit earlier and smaller steps. Yeah, because that requires you to have a baby and then get birth and then have a conversation. Yeah, so too many things stacked up there. Our time is coming to an end quite soon, and I always ask our guest the same question as we end, which is compared to or other global majority people in the UK. Global majority people, I mean, normally people mean like the ethnic minorities, yeah, but people don't like to
Mm,
call them minorities. We are the actual global majority people. So
mm,
within this group, the East and Southeast Asian in the UK are a relatively very small community, and their presence and voice of the Christian who are East and Southeast Asian are actually even smaller and hidden. What encouragement would you give to our listeners and other East and Southeast Asian out there that can encourage them?
well, you know what? You're not alone, right? I'm so grateful that, Wayne, and I'm not saying this just because you're the host of the podcast and you've invited me along to do this episode, but I'm just so grateful for individuals like you who pull together, right? This sort of community together, and that we can learn from each other, that we can really just share and grow in our faith with each other. Find your community. That would be my tip, right? Find your community, right? Because this is not something that one should do alone, right? You should definitely find those who are going to be on your team. And I'm really grateful that you're on my team, Wayne.
Me too.
Yeah, so that would be my sort of closing sort of tip for those listeners out there.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And to be completely not Asian, I want to say I am so grateful for your comment. I feel so excited. I feel so proud that you said about what we're doing, and I feel so excited that you are part of our group. And so, if you're listening out there and you feel like, oh, I want to be part of this, I want to learn to how to do this. Well, speak to us. Drop us an email. Subscribe to us, comment, and we can maybe help you to think about how can you also create own community like this, to have conversation, to begin that work as well.
Absolutely.
Uh, Next week, we'll be talking about food. So we'll talk about language and different things. And next week, and the essential, probably the only key thing about our Asian community is about food. And how does that shape our identity? And how does that really relate to our identity in the West and how other people perceive us? So that's our session next time. And so really, thank you for listening. Thank you for Esther to be part of our group and this podcast. And I really hope this podcast will give people a beginning journey to find redemption of your Asian identity in Christ and find a voice in your own community and really bring out the best that He has made you to be in your own life. So thank you and see you next time.